and I'm with the Faculty of Education at Brock University. I'm also playing dual roles today. I'm Program Chair for the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. I also sit on the steering committee for the Equity Issues portfolio of Congress. And so through those dual roles, we've been able to do something quite unique this year in that we've had two featured panels through Congress that are supported and funded by Congress and the Equity Issues portfolio. I'm really pleased. Today we have Nuances. And we have a wonderful team of researchers. I just want to give you the gist of the meaning of the panel itself. It brings together 4 prominent Black studies scholars from a variety of disciplines to discuss the complexities of Black presence in the Canadian Academy, eschewing a monolithic concept of Black studies, Black scholars, and the issues they face in the Academy. It reveals instead the diversity of African Canadian scholars' identity and identification by examining the wide range of disciplinary to multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, indeed the post-disciplinary work in the field. In addition to these nuances, this session also addresses the contributions of both Black scholars and Black studies to equity issues and social sciences and humanities in Canada. Again, it is funded by and supported by the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. So, to begin with, we have Professor Afua Cooper from Dalhousie. The title of her presentation is The Spook Who Sat by the Door, Creating Black Studies at a Canadian University. A little bit of background on Professor Cooper. She is the James R. Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies at Dalhousie University. She has been researching African Canadian historical studies for over 25 years. Her consistent work in the area makes her one of the leading Canadian and international researchers in the field. Areas of expertise include Black women's history, slavery, abolition, freedom, law, culture, and political consciousness. Afua has also made extensive contributions in the field of Black studies by working with such public history institutions as libraries, archives, museums, in creating Black history-themed exhibitions, in addition to developing and teaching courses at Dalhousie and spearheading a Black Studies program at that institution. She's also taught at Ryerson University, University of Toronto, York University, Simon Fraser University. She is also a fellow she has been at Brown University. And her book, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Canadian Slavery and the Burning of Old Montreal, is a signature publication on slavery in Canada and the Black Atlantic. So, welcome.
Thank you, Delana, and thank you, my fellow panelists, and thanks to everyone for coming out to this presentation. I drew my inspiration for this talk from the book when I was asked to be a part of the presentation, and I thought, what is it I'm going to talk about? What can I say? How can I say what I want to say? There were so many things that we can say about this topic. So what came to mind was this book, this character, Dan Freeman. Those of you who read the book, The Spook Who Sat by the Door. The book was published in 1969. And I read it ages ago, but it stayed with me. They've made a movie of it. And the character, Dan Freeman, was the writer of the book is Sam Greenlee. And he himself was a trained CIA person, and he left the agency and he became a poet and a writer and all of that. So I think a lot of what he writes about Dan Freeman in the book is based on his life and his experiences. But the spook, some of you know, that's was a term, a name for Black people, a spook. But in this case, the story is the CIA was accused of being a segregated institution. And it was the 60s or 50s, and they wanted the heights of the civil rights movement, and they wanted to integrate the movement. So they brought on 25 qualified black men and they only needed one. But they flunked out 24. The intention was to flunk out all 25 for a variety of reasons. So whether they weren't physically fit, whether they were intellectually unfit, whether they dated white women, that would disqualify them, because of course they followed them all over the place to see what they did, whether they drank alcohol, whether they took drugs. The whole idea was we are going to flunk them out. But there was this one who you couldn't get him on drugs, you couldn't get him on white women, he paid his taxes, everything, Dan Freeman, and he was able to be trained as an agent in the CIA, an undercover agent. But he quickly realized that while he passed and he was appointed special assistant to the director of the CIA, he quickly realized that he wasn't going to do anything real or with substance. So they had him in a glass office right next to the office of the director of the CIA. So he was very visible. He was not a light-skinned black. He couldn't pass for white. He was very dark, very visible. So when you pass his office to go to the director's office, you would see this black man. The CIA has been integrated. Of course, he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't doing any undercover work, nothing. His job was to be there as a spook who sat by the door. The CIA could not be accused of being racist or not being an integrated agency. So that's how that's how sometimes I feel, you know, as a black person in the academy. And I told Delana that I worked at all those institutions that she named, and every single one of them I felt at some point in my tenure there, I was a spook. I was the black face that the chair or the dean or whomever could say and say, oh, well, you know, Afu is here and she's doing that, and very, very conspicuous. But after a while, realizing that you're not really going to make any structural change at all. You're one of the Negro first or the Negro firsters, and that's how the system wants it to be, even in this day and age. Okay, so that's a preamble. The first question is, do we as black scholars feel we have a duty, in quotation marks, to advance blackness in the academy, however way we want to define it? So if we're a physicist, if we're a black physicist, do we think we have a duty or to advance blackness? And I chose physicists for a specific reason. As a historian or a sociologist, it seems kind of natural because those are, you know, humanities and social sciences, which supposedly deal better with black issues than, say, physics or chemistry or mathematics. I also have to bear in mind that as I speak on this issue or on this panel, that I don't feel totally free to express myself at all. I really don't feel totally free. I speak lurking in the audience, might be my dean or the chair or whomever, and they're going to go back and say, oh, you know, Afu was bad-mouthing us. Because I'm criticizing and critiquing the institutions that I work for. So I'm literally biting the hands that feed me. And so that's the other thing, right? We have the right to bite the hand that feed us. Knowing that there could be some repercussions, there could be consequences to my expressing myself and being a part of this panel. It could impact my work and my well-being. So back to the question of duty. Do we feel we have a duty to advance black studies? Do we those of us who don't work specifically in a Black Studies realm or have a Black Studies agenda, do we feel that somehow we have to make a contribution to the field for racial uplift? But Blackness is what some of us do. I'm a Black Studies chair. Doesn't mean that there's a Black Studies department. We'll get to that. I teach Black Studies. My raison d'etre within the Academy is Black Studies. I am Black. I perceive myself as Black. And I'm perceived by the world, by my university, as Black. Blackness is what I do and who I am. So, let me talk a bit about my chair. It's James Robinson Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies. It was named after James Robinson Johnston, the first Black lawyer in Nova Scotia, and he was called to the bar in 1900. He matriculated at Dalhousie University. And the chair was established finally in 1996 after about a decade of fundraising. Members of the Black community raised about $1.5 million to establish this chair. At that time, that was just about what you needed to establish an endowed chair. The Black community raised the money, and they worked out a relationship with Dalhousie University to establish the chair there. Now, did Dalhousie University want Black Studies? I think not. But no university in its right mind is going to turn down $1.5 million in 1995 or 1996. So Dalhousie University had Black Studies thrust upon them. And the reason that the committee chose Dalhousie University was for a number of reasons. One of the principal fundraisers, Beverly Mascow, is a Nova Scotian. So she wanted the chair to be established in Nova Scotia. Another reason, not necessarily the second reason, but another reason is that Nova Scotia, maybe the principal reason, has the longest Black history in Canada. Goes back to 1604. Black communities in Nova Scotia, obviously, go back to many, many generations. And also to kind of repair a relationship with Dalhousie University. Dalhousie University did not have a good relationship with the local Black community. It was seen as standoffish, as snobbish, as racist. In fact, when the university was founded, was registered, I would say, because no teaching happened then. In 1808, it wasn't 1808, 1816. In the next 2 years, you're going to celebrate the bicentennial. In 1816, there was a clause there put in by Lord Dalhousie himself that banned the entry or admission of Black people from that institution. And over the years since that time, Blacks in Halifax region would prefer and did go to St. Mary's University or Mount St. Vincent as opposed to Dalhousie. I didn't mean Black people didn't go to Dalhousie. Obviously they did. James Robinson Johnson went there. But people preferred St. Mary's University or Mount St. Vincent over Dalhousie. They felt that wasn't welcoming. It was literally a white city. So this money was given to Dalhousie to establish this endowed chair, and it was a way that the community worked out with the university to diversify the faculty. So a chair, and I'm the third chair. So you would bring in this person, they would serve for 5 or 6 years, after which they would join the department, the sponsoring department, as permanent faculty, and then a new person would be brought in as chair. My thinking, if that's what you're going to use to diversify the university, it's going to take 1,000 years to diversify. Nonetheless, we're in the era of, these buzzwords, diversity, and let's not forget in inclusion. That's another buzzword. So that's how the chair came about, and that's how it's been practiced in that way. So I'm midway in my tenure. I've been there now for 3 years. So it's called the Black Studies Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies. However, it's a curious thing because we have a chair, a Black Studies chair, and there's no Black Studies program at that institution. So people would often call, my phone would ring, and people would often say, well, what are the courses you're offering in this program? You know, we want to take this course. As far as from Toronto, people would call. And I would say, well, we really don't have a program. But I do teach courses. I do teach. There are 2 courses that I teach in the Sociology and Social Anthropology department. I teach a course called Social Movements, which I have blackened. And I teach another course called Colonialism and the Body, which I also, it has been blackened, right? So I do teach courses with a lot of Black Canadian studies content. So my idea now is to launch a minor and also to work with Black faculty, other Black faculties, in setting up a program that seems to make sense. But I was sort of called in by people in the higher level administration, and they said, well, that's not really our idea for your chair. Our idea for your chair is that it would support you as an individual scholar. You do your research, you do some public outreach, and you teach. It's really to advance your personal career. We don't want any structural changes here. So after 3 years, I finally got it, because it took me 3 years to realize that this is what they wanted. I had a totally different idea. I went into Dalhousie, you know, like a hurricane. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I set up a lecture series and out there with community outreach, and also doing my own research. So it is kind of good that we now know what we're about. Me on this side, the school on the other side. So there's also a struggle to set up a minor. You wouldn't believe this. Every time we fulfill what is required, they move the goalposts. So I mean, maybe the reason depth of my work, I would say, is to combat this historical erasure. Historical erasure in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and kind of now fighting at the level of, you know, the administration to say, hey, you have to, these buzzwords, diversity and inclusion, which is on every document that Dalhousie sends out, you have to honor them. So I'm having meetings with the new president of the university, and just talking about that kind of thing. And my last meeting with the president, I said, hey, you know, you need to be, I need you to be the lover of my chair, to sponsor my chair, to promote my chair, kind of getting him on it. We'll see how far that goes. So at the end of the day, I go back to what I think was my objective as a graduate student, as an undergraduate student, and that was revolutionary blackness. We have formed the Black Canadian Studies Association. We had our big conference here last year at Brock. Tamari organized it, and I believe we met in this very room. And the Black Canadian Studies Association, we've been through many hurdles, jumped many hurdles, but it is an organization that's dedicated to overcome some of these hurdles that we face in doing blackness in the Canadian Academy. And I'll just read, and then I'm done. I'll just read something from the book, page 47, The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Freeman was appointed the next week as a special assistant to the director. He was given a glass enclosed office in the director's suite. His job was to be black and conspicuous as an integrated Negro of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. As long as he was there, one of an officer corps of thousands, no one could accuse the CIA of not being integrated. And I'm saying I feel universities have us like that, as long as they have us, you know, as head of departments, you know, chair, whatever, assistant professor, no one can accuse them of that. We are the Negro firsters. I think that's a terrible thing in 2014 to still be a Negro first. Thank you.
I do have to say something one thing about Annette, because she is one of those scholars that has been incredibly influential for myself and for other Black women. That her work has been inspirational. It's been a lifeline. It has been leading in terms of other Black women marking their own inroads. So, Lynette, I have to say I'm very grateful for you and your contribution.
Okay, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. So the title of my talk is We Especially Welcome Applications from Members of Visible Minority Groups, Reflections on Race, Gender and Life at Three Universities. That's an awfully long title, but I wanted in this paper, although I'm not going to talk about that here, I wanted to show how, that title gives us a sense that something else is really true, right? And when I lived in the United States, and my American friends would just marvel at that equity statement, and they think, oh, Canada's this place where all is well, where people live in multicultural harmony, and so on and so forth. So in this session, I know in the 3 o'clock session, I'm going to talk a little more about gendered racism there, even though there's no separation, it's all connected. So I'm going to read a little bit from the paper, and then I'm going to talk as well. And so, this is Canada. We don't talk about race here. This was the response of a facilitator when I mentioned race at a conflict resolution workshop for new department heads at UBC. Perhaps we don't talk about race, but as Francis Henry and colleagues write, systemic racism is a normative aspect of Canadian ways of doing things and deeply entrenched in university culture. Having lived in Ontario from 1965 to 1992 and now in Vancouver since 2010, I'm aware firsthand of the ways that race and racialization play out in Canadian context. However, I've been disappointed, though not surprised, at the lack of engagement with race at UBC almost 20 years after leaving and coming back. David Gilbourne writes that far from being immune to the wider sources that create and sustain race inequalities in society, institutions of higher education are especially prone to reproducing those inequalities beneath a facade of meritocracy and colorblindness. So in this paper, I'm really interested in how affable, intelligible white people who espouse ideals of social justice seem to have little, if any, consciousness of the ways in which their attitudes and behaviors are interpreted as racist by their non-white colleagues. We're really good in university settings, and I think before I talked about that a little bit, but we're really good in university settings of saying, you know, we're diverse, we have more faculty of color than, you know, X university, more indigenous faculty, blah, blah, blah. But basically, when it comes down to what's actually happening, it's a different story. Catherine McKittrick writes that Black women challenge how we know and understand the world, how we resist erasure and subordination, and how we navigate white racialized spaces. Within the first week at UBC, I realized how much of a white racialized space it was. I had to tread very softly. So, in this paper, I just wanted to say that I've done an autoethnographic study, and I've used critical race studies, Black feminisms as well, and also I put life histories up there because so much of my work is informed by life history work. to talk too much about methodology at this point, but I just wanted to say that in my work I look at oppositional narratives, and I know today the notion of counter-stories has become quite popular. And I think for the most part, Black narratives are oppositional narratives. I just wanted to, again, talk about autoethnography in the sense that you're blending ethnography with the personal and the cultural and the social. And, oh, sorry, got rid of that slide. A couple of terms that I'm using in this paper that I don't usually use. For example, well, I think critical race theorists have made widely popular the term microaggressions, and I don't really use that term very much, and I played with it quite a bit in this paper. And I'm just going to show you that slide so that I don't have to read it. I mean, I'm making assumptions. People can see that. But here are two examples from my work at UBC. Examples of racialized and gendered microaggressions. So Chester Pierce is the person who is responsible for the term, although I find at least in education people seem to think Delgado and, you know, Stefancic and other people responsible for the term. Here are two examples. About a month into being department head at UBC, a staff member said to me, "Isn't there something you can do with your hair? You know, press it down a bit." This question dredged up a historical and biographical set of white supremacist and pejorative attitudes towards Black women's unstraightened hair. As Cobain Mercer argues, hair is second only to skin color as a racial signifier. It's been the subject of ridicule and disdain by whites for centuries. And we could even say by Blacks, in that sometimes self-hatred makes one do that. So my staff member saw my hair as transgressive and unruly, and that I should approximate whiteness and press it down a bit. It just about every job I've been at, my hair has been an issue, a question. And another example, a lecturer, instructor rather, said to me, as I was putting on a woolen hat on a cold winter's day, "You look like a Rwandan refugee." Her comments reflect the white media's construction, representation, and circulation of the sign of Blackness, particularly the Rwandan genocide. Both women's put-downs reflect the inferiorized corporality of Black women, a theme that dates back to slavery. And that's something that I was really quite taken aback by, the amount of comments like that on a regular basis. I also wanted to say that, oh, look at that. I had no idea, and you never said anything. Oh my goodness gracious. You can't see anything down here. I can't see what I'm doing.
Touch the screen. Did it go off?
Okay, thank you. So, okay. I also just want to say that another theme I use in the paper is there's the notion of disconscious racism, which is quite different from microaggressions, and I think it really helps us look at systemic issues. You know, Joyce King says, you know, it's not preconscious or unconscious. It's very conscious, but it's working from a distorted set of understandings. And so what I really actually prefer this term to microaggressions because there's nothing really subtle about racism. And so I think it gets at that. I know microaggressions is sort of subtle the subtle, aggressive acts, but there's nothing subtle about it. So I'm going to move on a bit because we're running out of time here. So I'm just going to start right here. There are a couple of scenarios in the paper, and I'll talk about one very briefly. To be an insurgent intellectual or an agent of change is not permitted for a black woman. I think Afua made that very clear. When she rocks the status quo, when her behaviors thwart expectations, the results might be microaggressions, as this is a quote, subtle or blatant attempts of punishing the unexpected behavior. A quote by Gutierrez and et al. In Presumed Incompetent. So I give an example of a firing of a staff member. So in August 2012, I fired an office manager that was called Betty. And of course, that's very devastating. And in universities, I don't think people are fired very often, and they don't get fired by a black woman, that's for sure. So my faculty members, in two meetings and in emails, pressed me to breach confidentiality and divulge personnel information regarding the staff member. I did not. So they ensured that this unwieldy black woman and their concerns about this unwieldy black woman went straight to the provost's desks. Indeed, as Sanchez Recles reminds us, black women in the workforce have often been regarded as tokens, deviants, invisible, isolates of low status, regardless of their job title, credentials, or competence. My concern here is the objectification evident in this event. The dividing practices of whiteness were clearly articulated in these meetings, and an insider-outsider line was drawn, I felt more exposed, drowning in this sea of white faces. To my close friends, I referred to these meetings as the lynchings, to underscore the panoptic, the mob mentality, and also to underscore the unspeakable terror and harassment I lived with during these meetings and for months afterwards. Drawing on Sartre and Foucault, Françoise Lyonnais reminds us that the look, le regard, is pathological. It subjects us to the shaming potential of the other's regard and is a tool of discipline and control within the panoptic regimes of power and knowledge. Deidre Davis contends the black woman's history of enslavement grounds our experiences of harassment in ways that are qualitatively distinct and approximate what Patricia Williams calls spirit murder. In these meetings, those who are esteemed or considered, and the department leaders spoke up. So this office manager, Betty, we'll call her, so they would say, Betty's one of us. She belongs to the community. She's been here for years. You're new here. You're not from here. We're afraid of you. We need healing. And so I really wondered about the two possibilities of belonging. 16 out of the 27 signed a letter of support to the provost regarding Betty. I've got 1 minute left, I'm told. So I just wanted to say that I'll just move to the end. So I looked at, I used Sylvia Winter, and he talks about the issues of liminality, and Catherine Lusby, who looks at the relationship between in-groups and out-groups, and Zeus Leonardo, who looks at components of white racism. Remember, my question was, how can affable, intelligent white people say and do things that, that we find to be racist? So these three components are a willingness to name the contours of racism. I could not have a discussion with anybody. I could not have, people just would not acknowledge that racism exists. The avoidance of identifying with a racial experience of group, again, removing themselves from anything to do with racism, so that I couldn't have any discussions with people. Catherine McKittrick argues that one of the erasure tactics in Canada is to see race and racial concerns as a surprise, the outcome of wonder, an unexpected or astonishing event, circumstance, person, or thing. I don't know why that quote just makes me laugh, because it's so true, but nobody talks about it in that way. And the minimization of a racist legacy was the very last one. So the minimization, it's just astounding to me that this, I mean, I'm dealing with people who have PhDs, very literate, highly literate people. Somehow, nobody's read about anything to do with racism in British Columbia or BC. And so, you know, you could just go to the library and find books, articles in the newspaper. UBC is known, has had a number of racist incidents, but yet nobody's aware of them. So that's one of the ways in which things are minimized. And so I just want to say, since I obviously am over time, that you know, what I'm hoping for is, as Toni Morrison mentions in Playing in the Dark, is for the critical gaze to change from the racial object to the racial subject. Thank you.
I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Tamara, who is an associate professor of sociology here at Brock University, and does not want me to say much more than that, but honestly, he's done an incredible job.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Lamona for all the remarkable work that she's done at the Congress in general, and in particular, this particular session. So I'm not going to speed along, but I will be brisk, and I'll try to be coherent, all at the same time. I just, a quick contextualization. I want to do something of a two-part presentation that I hope will be coherent. The first part will be addressing what I regard to be an epistemological issue, but also an existential one. And then I want to connect that to my own body as a text in the university. So the title of the talk is Certainty of Uncertainty, Academia, Whiteness, and the Invisible Man's Shadow. I purposely did not change the man in this reference to Ralph Ellison's book, because I don't, as much as the later part of the presentation is going to recognize how the bodies of African women are also read, I also don't want to submerge that particularity under my own masculinist gaze. So there's something that I want to gesture to simultaneously, that there's something that I'm speaking to from my own vantage point, but also recognizing that there's something phallocratic and patriarchal about that recognition simultaneously. So Afua started off by talking about, making a statement about being insurgent and whether offering a critique is biting the hand that feeds you. And I want to start off with two observations or interesting points for me. Last year, the BCSA had its conference here at Brock University. And the Vice Provost at the time, VP Academic Dr. Murray Canutala, was all gung-ho about the conference. He's all down with developing a program of study, Black Canadian Studies at Brock University. So much so that he committed himself to going cap in hand to deans and chairs of the university to raise the tens of thousands of dollars to bring Mikhail Jean to Brock last year. So he went to the chairs and ponied up thousands of dollars each. The deans, thousands of dollars each for the total of what it took to bring Mikhail Jean here. And that's quite a significant commitment on the part of the university. The other thing I want to quickly mention is I just received, not just, but 2 weeks ago, received word from the Dean of my Faculty of Social Sciences that a complaint lodged against me demanding that I be fired from my post at Brock University was deemed frivolous and vexatious. The root of that complaint was that I defended the academic freedom of a young African-American Fulbright scholar whose research examines the Underground Railroad in St. Catharines and in the Maritimes in Nova Scotia. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because the person who lodged the complaint, organization that lodged the complaint, is an African-Canadian organization, right? So, inasmuch as there was no substance to their complaint, the fact that the dean of my faculty was solidly behind me says something about the paradoxes when dealing with race and racism and whiteness in the Canadian university. So there's something about the nature of race in Canada which is pervasive in all of our institutions that does require a response. So I have a quote here from Edward T. Hall, Beyond Culture, where he's saying that people find it, or they can't fight the institutions on which their lives depend. This is absolutely false. We have the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Russian Revolution, all of them, the Bolivarian Revolution, all of them indicate that people are in fact fighting and resisting the institutions upon which their lives depend because they're demanding that those institutions fulfill their promise of recognizing the equal humanity of all people. So, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to work out for myself how to offer a critique of the institution without undermining the institution itself, because as I pointed out, the BCSA conference was here last year, and there's no literally academic unit nor administrative unit that did not contribute in some way, shape, or form to the conference. So what I'm trying to figure out for myself is how to understand the institution and how to be able to maneuver within the institution to build relationships based on solidarity with persons of goodwill. So I understand the institution as a place with a mandate. Each institution has a mandate. Institutions are also discourses, right? The way that they talk about how they say that they're going to do things, right, in terms of fulfilling that mandate is distinctive to each institution. Institutions are also rules, right? They're also sanctions that sustain the legitimacy of each institution. This academic institution, by and large, is self-regulating, self-policing, right? So its mechanisms for discipline are, by and large, internal and are supposed to be coherent in the sense that it doesn't matter what your race, class, gender, sexuality is. There are norms and it applies to everyone. And finally, institutions are relationships, right? It's not this amorphous, huge institution. It's also apparatus. It's about relationships at the end of the day. And so the challenge is to cultivate relationships where solidarities can be built to fundamentally make those challenges to the institution without undermining the value of the institution. And in fact, the assumption is that by challenging the institution, we're actually upholding its values. But no institution, or all institutions exist to maintain and perpetuate extant relationships, with all of that said. I spent some time reading the work of Alvin Goldner and trying to understand who I am as an intellectual and who I am as a person of African descent as an intellectual. And he identifies these characteristics that pertain to intellectuals and the intelligentsia class: freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, identification of social problems and solutions, and clarification and production of correct ideas and beliefs. This means that within the context of the institution itself, right, there is a contending conception about what ideas are true, right? The university is not a monolith. But there's a problem in the institution, as there is with any Canadian institution, to the extent that it's predicated upon the values and ideals of patriarchy, colonialism, racism, capitalism. Institutions exist to perpetuate extant social orders. One of the things that happens in Canadian universities is a form of strategic denial and strategic management of systemic racism. This can come about through the hiring that Afua spoke about, the way in which the hiring takes place, and then subsequently the lack of supports, lack of mentoring, lack of policies to ensure that there is strong retention are all important ways that the denial, the strategic denial, takes place. So inasmuch as there is a growing reaction against the buzzwords of equity and diversity, these are values that the university, as the course says, espouses, they mouth, they mimic, and we have a right to demand that they live up to that value. So that by way of the epistemological and, what else did I call it? Existential, right? So I'm making my living from this place that I'm critiquing. But Alvin Goldman says that's our job, right? So I'm safe, because Alvin Goldman said so. So, Frantz Fanon. Let's now deal with the issue of institutional racism and how bodies are read in the academy. Fanon says, all institutions in a racist society are therefore racist. It's not a statement of condemnation. It's an observation that alerts us to the struggles that we have to undertake in the institution. And Bobby Wright, an African-American revolutionary academic, pretty much says the same thing, right? So this is not a question of castigating individual persons for you, white person, are racist. No, this is the nature of the institution that reproduces racism in various ways. Whether one opposes whiteness or not, the institution exists to perpetuate it. So what we're fundamentally dealing with when we're talking about, especially the bodies of African people, is how they're read, and in terms of what constitutes, what constitutes visibility versus invisibility. One of the issues that I think is emerging in Canada right now, which has long been the case in the United States, they've been looking at the existential crisis of the black middle class in the United States. And there have been enough studies to demonstrate that there's a very strong component of neurosis when one is middle class and African American. The problem is, you don't know how to read racism, right? But you know it's there, but sometimes it comes with a smile, right? Poor African Americans, they found, have a more robust self-concept, right? But the trade-off is they don't extend beyond their immediate social circles, so they never have to confront the certainty of uncertainty. But there's a price that they have to pay for that simultaneously. This is beginning to be an issue in Canada, right? As we're hearing from academics talk about what it means in terms of how their bodies are read in an institution that says one thing but structurally performs things differently. So what I want to do is to quickly go through some images and then to talk about some personal experiences about how my body, some ways that has been read in the university. And what I want to center on are these black-face, black-body representations. And Brock University is not immune from this because we had a blackface incident here in 2007 that nothing happened. It was not addressed. Right? So there's something about the way that Sandra Gilman says the black body sexualizes spaces in which they enter. So just quickly going through these representations and then to talk about some experiences that I have that are consistent with the hypersexualization of the bodies of African men and the perception that we constitute threats. But I also want to gesture to the way that there's a distinction between nakedness and nudity, and that the bodies of white women, white people, for example, can be nude, but our bodies are naked. And this says something about the possibility and the prospect of a naked person standing in front of you who is supposed to be the reflection of nature, the embodiment, but is manifesting the ideal of the brain, which is supposed to be representative of European culture and whiteness. So I just want to quickly talk about three scenarios before I move on to wrap up with the implications. The first of these is that I applied for a job at a prominent Southwestern university in 2006, and the interview was going well, I thought, until I noticed something was going on between the guy that was the chair of the department and one of his colleagues. the chair of the department launched on this blistering attack, compelling me to explain whether racism exists in Canada or not. So I found ways to dance around that. His colleague, however, a white American from the southern US, said that he has a great deal of problems with black people because when he was 10 years old, he was fondled in a washroom by an African American. Now, I didn't quite figure out what that got to do with me. But his essential point, and it's on record because it's in the lawyer's report, is that he was afraid of my body. My body threatened him, right? And as far as he was concerned, my very being in the same department that he would be in would be constitutive of a perpetual threat against him. I chose to turn down that job, though they offered it to me, because how is it possible to work in such an institution where none of the colleagues stopped him at that moment in time? Maybe they were all aghast. That's quite possible. The second, I frequently give lectures in my sociology of punishment class about the myths of race and rape. And after one such lecture, one of my students approached me, a white woman, and she said to me, "You know, Professor, I have to tell you this, that some of my friends, they tell me that they're afraid of going downtown St. Paul Street because they're afraid of being raped by black men." This is 2 years ago. Paul Bernardo, who was a Scarborough rapist, destroyed the lives of many women of color, which they don't tell you. Came to St. Catherine's, but these young white women are not afraid of blonde-haired, blue-eyed white men. There's something about the ways that my body and the bodies of African males actually were existential threats to them because we were the projected fantasies of the white male rapist. And finally, I have a situation where when I was a graduate student, there was one mantra that my mentors kept telling me, which was, if you ever become a professor, don't ever close your door with a young white woman in your office. So, I teach a fourth-year class called Decolonizing Criminology, and my office hours were set in the evening. It happened to be at 8 o'clock, and a young white woman came to my office to have a conversation about her paper. Immediately as she sat down, she began to tremble, to shake, and began to cry. And I thought maybe she was having some sort of stress in her life, and I was like going to offer the Student Development Center somewhere to go. And I said, like, what's the problem? Is there something wrong? She said she'd never been this close to a black man before. And I said, like, so what does this mean to you? She says, well, where I come from, I'm not going to say where, basically 905 farming zones. The television that we get from Toronto is mayhem, murder, rape, drugs, and it's all associated with black men. The terror that I had for 15 minutes was what would happen if someone came by and saw this woman crying in my office. What if she made a complaint? I was in absolute terror. Did not know what to do. And I'm an atheist, and I prayed for the 15-minute. I used to go to church, and the pastor used to say this fine brimstone Scottish preacher said there are no atheists in foxholes. That was a foxhole, and I found God. Okay, so that's quickly about the way bodies get read. So very quickly then, there are mental health implications for this. There are issues of credibility when black bodies are presenting in an institution predicated upon higher learning. This has great implications for course and professor evaluations, particularly since they are relevant for tenure and promotion. And I've spoken to quite a few young black women faculty members who are constantly getting negative course evaluations, and they're terrified about the implications for tenure and promotion. And finally, the issue of collegiality. That there are very conscientious colleagues that actually understand these dynamics and what is taking place, and I'll name one of them right now, June Corman. June Corman understands this dynamic very well. And so again, it's about trying to build strategic relationships with allies who understand that the institution itself is not immune from the racism which is pervasive in our society. Thank you.
We have next Emma Wright, professor and director of the Center for Culture, Identity, quickly, he's a sole or co-edited author of 15 pieces of publications, as well as 3 co-edited books. And if you want to see or hear more about Handlewright, you can always go to the Educational Studies Department and look at the Center for Culture and Identity and Education at UBC. Thank you.
Thanks, Delana. Thanks for all your hard work. I've actually written a paper, and I assure you I don't read very boring, and I'll try to read it. It's an understatement, of course, to speak of the presence of blacks in the Canadian Academy as awkward. I've done so taking my cue from Canada's image text, part of which reads politeness and understatement. Canada's image text also reads tolerant, diversity positive, inherently multicultural. After all, we gave the world official multiculturalism. Non-racial, no need to be post-racial since we were never racial, let alone racist. And ethically, ethnically, and morally superior to our neighbor to the south. And the Canadian University as an ivory tower of innovation, inclusion, intellectual freedom is a fortress where academics in particular, but students also, are safe from any pesky social problems, including the rare incidents of discrimination. Critical faculty and students from racialized and minoritized groups know different. We know this image text to be a hegemonic perennial myth. Canadian colleges and universities and the Canadian Academy are a microcosm of Canadian society and reflect a Canada that has a long history of numerous forms of discrimination and marginalization, going back to a deliberately under-acknowledged history of slavery, coming up to the 2011 blackface incidents at McGill University, and including racism at the individual, institutional, structural, and societal levels, much like the United States. Now, Francis Henry and Carl Tater are prominent figures in the effort to directly document and address the problem of racism in Canadian society and the Academy. The Canadian Academy is a true part of the Great White North, with serious problems around hiring, recruitment, retention, promotion. Is it still up? I've lost it on the screen. Okay, yeah, of racialized faculty and staff, including Aboriginal. The result is that the black body is what Fanon would refer to as an illicit presence, a body out of place on campus. And the black academic ends up being what I have called the unexpected professor, received not with the crude shock of Fanon's Negro at large, look mama, a Negro, but rather a polite translation of that discomfort into the raised eyebrow, the furtive second glance, the overly familiar backslap, subtle affective reactions in which institutional white privilege and anti-black racism both melt into thin air yet permeate everywhere. It is important to consider blackness in the context of a Canadian Academy reflective of Canadian society in need of addressing its historical and contemporary forms of discrimination against racialized and minoritized individuals and groups. And indeed, there is theoretical and activist work that does exactly this. I want to turn now to another way of characterizing the Canadian Academy at the present historical juncture. Like much of the Academy worldwide, it has become the Neoliberal Academy in a time of austerity. Henry Giroux has produced a succinct and trenchant a summative description of the neoliberal status quo as any, when he declared the mantras of neoliberalism are now well known. Government is the problem, society is a fiction, sovereignty is market-driven, deregulation and commodification are vehicles for freedom, and higher education should serve corporate interests rather than the public good. This ideological set of propositions does not only hold hegemonic sway, it has passed into common sense, with serious implications for higher education. There is considerable literature that severely critiques this notion of the university. This is literature produced by academics who hold a radically different view of the nature and function of the university, captured most succinctly in Stuart Hall's trenchant assertion that the university is a critical institution or it is nothing. Hall, therefore, advocates critical academics go beyond academic work to undertake intellectual work and sees the two as being both distinct and complexly related. What is interesting about critical discussions of the neoliberal university in times of austerity is that its primary subject and indeed audience is the tenure-track academic. When it does deal with diverse constituencies, it considers the place of faculty versus administrators, or the fate of tenured and tenure-track faculty versus non-tenure-track sessionals, and admirably but rarely, graduate and undergraduate students. And when it comes to the disciplines, the focus is on the precarious position of the humanities, and to a lesser extent, the social sciences. What this literature does not usually address is the specifics of the socio-cultural identity of these constituencies, of academics and students as embodied subjects. My position is that it is both crucial and urgent that we introduce identity politics and socio-cultural difference into the discussion of neoliberal university in a time of austerity, and that we also introduce neoliberal university in a time of austerity to our discussion of Black Canadian studies. In other words, what is needed to understand the position of Blackness in the academy is the imbrication of critical anti-racism and a critique of neoliberalism. Consider the following concrete example. In 2012, the Chronicle of Higher Education published a blog entry from a conservative blogger, Naomi Schaefer, entitled, "The Most Persuasive Case for Eliminating Black Studies? Just read the dissertations." It is important to name this for what it is, a racist attack on and dismissal of an entire field of study, exacerbated by a focus on its most vulnerable constituents, its students. And indeed, many of the responses to the blog did exactly that. These responses, however, do not fully acknowledge the potential danger posed. This and similar attacks on identity politics-based studies in general in the US are occurring precisely at a time of neoliberal austerity in which universities are supposedly under constant pressure to cut staff and programs. It is the humanities in particular and the social sciences next that are in particular danger of being cut. And here's a Facebook entry, and I have her permission, by Faye Harris, who teaches anthropology at the University of Florida, to illustrate this kind of point. And it is identity-based programs of study, women's studies, ethnic studies, LGBT studies, Aboriginal studies, that are particularly at risk of elimination as being impractical, frivolous, self-indulgent, and indeed a danger to heritage, community values, and national cohesion. We cannot dismiss attacks like Schaefer's as something that occurred in the US, since, for example, in my case, I was reading this argument for the elimination of Black studies from my office at the University of British Columbia, an institution which I joined in 2005 and was shocked to find had no program of Africana studies, no African studies, no Black Canadian studies, no Africa and its diaspora studies, no Africana studies. Call it what you may, we simply did not have it. After much student and faculty agitation, especially by the student organization Africa Awareness, we now have an undergraduate minor in African studies. But you can imagine how precarious its position is in these times. And to think there is so much work to be done on Africana studies in Canada. To give you just one example, teasing out the relationship between Africa and its diaspora alone means working on any number of distinct theories and discursive formations, from Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism to Leopold Senghor and Leon Damas's Negritude to Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, etc., etc. And yet, at so many Canadian institutions, Africana studies is at best marginal, located in Spivak's words, outside in the teaching machine. But marginality is not all negative. As both Gloria Anzaldúa and Bell Hooks remind us, the margins are not only a site of exclusion and deprivation, but also a site of resistance, a location of radical openness and possibility, as Bell Hooks puts it. So far from being simply a victim of discrimination, and in part in reaction to this, we need to speak of an activist blackness in the Canadian Academy, including a growing Black Canadian Studies Association, which has been mentioned by both Afu and Tamari, and active contributions to discussions on historical and contemporary race and racism. And here are just 3 quick examples of that. There are various stances that academics take in relation to justice and representation at their institutions, communities and societies at large. Some choose to eschew it completely, while others tinker in academic and community activism, and yet others come close to what Gramsci identified as the organic intellectual. I hold that irrespective of whether they choose to engage or not, the Black academic is always already positioned, looked upon as a real or potential radical, an equity hire, a niche expert, a grateful conformist, etc., etc. There is no such thing as a neutral Black academic. The very category Black academic is an identity involving the employment of phenotypical characteristics in a willful homogenization of a very disparate set of folks, a strategic essentialism employed to create a united front by us, and a lazy failure to entertain difference within Blackness by others, and indeed too often by us. Blackness is a primarily diasporic identity that should not be about essentialized and romanticized roots, but about ever-evolving, complex, and contradictory roots. The formation of semi-solid identities, strong but pliant, definite but not definitive, clearly discernible but open to change. For some of us, especially those of us from what V.Y. Mudimbi has called an invented Africa, who were not Black back there, coming to Canada meant becoming Black. In other words, it meant being brought directly under the white gaze and being interpolated into such new identities as Black, Black Canadian, African Canadian, and incorporated into a hegemonic, self-contradictory, celebratory Canadian multiculturalism incapable of coping with what Stephen Vortek has identified as super diversity and uninterested in true recognition and just representation. So who are African Canadians? We are Francophone immigrants from Africa who, as Senghor declared of himself, speak better French than the best educated Parisian. Anglophone immigrants from the Caribbean for whom, as Marlene Mogesi Philip declared, English is a foreign language, a foreign anguish. We are Blacks who can trace their ancestry back as far as the Underground Railroad and the Black Loyalists, and contemporary African Americans recently hired despite all ads for academics positions specifying that preference will be given to Canadian citizens and landed immigrants. We are male, female, transgendered, intersex. We are straight, gay, and queer. We are the ironic and sometimes ambivalent beneficiaries of the one black rule. We are dark-skinned. We are biracial. Mulatto, Creole, Browning, Octoroon, Yellow Rose. We are Black members of interracial families. We are the progeny of interracial couples. Some of us are hidden, denied Black. We are frantically bleaching, desperately passing, almost white. And some of us are even part of the new Black. We are proudly African, spelled with a militant K, and passively hyphenated African Canadian, landed and rooted here but never fully belonging in the Canadian Academy nor in Canada. We are, as Gayatri Spivak says, asked to protect the margins of the Academy, situated in the nation as what Spivak has called not quite not citizens. We are those who, irrespective of how long or short our historical roots are in Canada, are constantly asked, so where are you from? We are an awkward presence, the other in position of authority and privilege, supposedly misplaced in the middle class and at the front of the class. We are Paul Giroir's Black Atlantic come ashore on Turtle Island. We are, as Gloria Ladson-Billings puts it, the children of field hands who have returned to do field work. If blackness is an always already politicized category, it is important to choose a position, an ideological stance from which to operate. My recommendation for critical black academics is a risky combination of the intellectual stance Stuart Hall calls blackness without guarantees, and what Edward Said calls the exile who crosses borders. Hall's Gramscian notion means that we should not consider our strategies to always be right simply because our identities, simply because of our identity and the fact that our ultimate goal of equity and recognition are right. It means taking intersectionality, acknowledging and working with and on the nuances of difference within the category black, even as we sometimes employ a strategic essentialized blackness. I'll skip to a conclusion now. The question is not whether or how we should reach beyond, and part of what I make, the point I make further in the paper is that we need to reach beyond blackness and make alliances with others. The question then is not whether, but how to reach beyond black identity politics, to work beside and with other marginalized, minoritized others. As a starting point, I would say we should heed the radically activist and politically sensitive approach advocated by Audre Lorde. We should choose recognition and just representation for blacks and black studies within and outside the academy, and indeed for all. And we should work on that project by forging alliances with and working on the edge of the battles of other progressive, racialized, minoritized peoples in a black version of what Spivak refers to as working in the spirit of conjunctural inclusiveness and solidarity. This, to me, is what critical blackness means or ought to mean in the Canadian Academy at this historical juncture of the confluence of ineffectual multiculturalism, perennial racism, neoliberal and austerity, neoliberalism and austerity on the one hand, and on the other, a multiple and pliant blackness as part of the Canadian super diversity, a strategically essentialized black agency, collaborative activism, and our knowledge and deep conviction that, as Peggy Bistro and others declared about black presence in Canada, we are rooted here and they can't pull us up. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the panelists. Really insightful and provocative papers. And now comes the really exciting part, is when we open up the floor and we ask for your questions, your queries, your challenges. I really get it. Okay, please go ahead.
Will we have access to the PowerPoint presentation?
Will you have access to, will they have access to the PowerPoint presentation?
Mine is not ready for prime time. So probably not, unfortunately.
I would like to say that eventually aspects of the presentation will be posted on the Equity Issues site for Congress. That typically, because it is an Equity Issues portfolio sponsored event, that's typically where the products of that are posted. Watch out for that. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, that was terrific. Do you want to talk at all about, since you might see that there's more risk now that there's more economic pressure on universities? I think it was partly to do with your piece that the stronger the push is to do economically viable things. I guess guess I was thinking, as you were talking about Emory, I mean, I've been to Emory where it's glaringly white. I mean, the buildings are glaringly white. It's supported by Coca-Cola. No wonder they're closing all the liberal things. Do you think all the African studies are subject to those same pressures now, increasingly, in Canadian universities? I mean, do you think you're suffering more now than before? Or we're all suffering? Or African studies particularly targets of not being business faculty?
Well, I mean, the African studies or it's not seen in some universities as a studies that curriculum having value. Right? My school, for example, there was an African studies program. It's closed down. I'm not sure this is competing marginalization, but UBC people can speak for themselves. I'm going to call it UBC, but schools like UBC, and certainly my school, in terms of area studies, what they see as important right now is Asian studies, right? Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and South Asia, because they're seeing these places and these people, they're bringing in money. So Asia Pacific studies, there are big embassies that go off to China and Vietnam, and huge delegations from various institutions to court and bring back students, so on and so forth. So that's where the money is, as seen by Canadian and American universities, and Australian universities, and British universities. So Africa, as much as these countries like Canada loot Africa on an hourly basis, we still don't see African studies or African-derived studies as something important or valuable.
One of the things I absolutely the same. We can say the same for UBC. The former president said we want UBC to be the University for Asia. When I was applying to UBC, I emailed several departments and areas of study where I said, if I were a Black Canadian student, would I be able to find courses that speak to my reality? And the emails I got back were, no, we don't have anything yet, but we're working on it. As soon as I got to UBC, I was asked to develop those programs in other faculties. So, of course, that's part of, we're just maids and mammies. But the other thing is, I see African studies as, maybe there's a list of things that the university would like to do, but it's always at the bottom. It never gets to it. So I think, as everyone said, it's ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching.
So that is,
Thank you for your wonderful presentations. I was very much inspired. And I appreciate the narratives, because the narratives really do drive the points clearly home. But I would like to put a little bit of a twist, and I would like to ask you how you would, I know that some of you already do try to transform the spaces that you're in, but how do you see yourself pulling out of these narratives in a way that you can create a transformational space within academia for people of color in general? Because I personally, as an Indian woman, I've never really seen Indian Studies Association or an Indian Studies department in the university. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on creating transformational spaces despite the hardships and the struggles that are being pulled. I would want to know, how could we move forward?
So I can respond to that in two ways. One, I have concern that there's a growing expectation that African people should be the voice for people of color. And I find that quite troubling because historically there's something about the black body when it speaks. It raises people's hackles and it opens spaces for conversation for alliances, for allegiances. And I find myself, I think the next frontier of critical race analysis in Canada is about the problematic relationship between this homogenized group of called people of color. The Canadian government routinely collects statistics on what's happening with people of color, but what they do is they aggregate the data in such a way that you don't see what's happening to African people. So if you look from 10 years ago to now, the rate of incarceration at the federal level for Aboriginals and African Canadians, proportional, exactly the same relative to their population. But what the Canadian government does is they submerge that data under the people of color category. So I think there's something dual taking place here where on one hand, these voices need to be insurgent and say, wait a minute, our bodies are read in particular ways and these are the implications. But on the other hand, we need to, as Handel says, advance a particular narrative of blackness which also makes itself open to relationships and alliances, but for me the issue is opening it. I think others need to step through that door also.
Can I just say that, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde, you mentioned Audre Lorde. Yeah, she says revolution isn't a one-time event. It's the consistent work. I read this, so I might get the wording of it. So the consistent belief that change is possible. And so I think that's what we have to do. I mean, Henry Drew says we have to live as if democracy exists, right? So we know the universities are corrupt and all this and so on and so forth, and yes, they feed us and so on. But I think transformation, one-on-one. We were talking last night about closing the door, but I do close the door. I will close the door very often with women in my office, or women of color in my office, and I'll say, this is the lowdown. Let me tell you what it's really like to be here. Let me tell you what you're in for. It's not, yes, it's a great life. It's a great life. I know that I have a great life. I'm not working in a factory. I don't have to ask somebody if I can go to the washroom. It's a great life. However, the structures are such that I think it's our duty to as feminists of color, to sit down with our students and say, and I might say this to if there's I have a Canadian man in my office, just says, haven't had one yet at UBC. I go looking for Handel when I'm on campus. Please tell me I'm not alone. But I think that's part of the transformation, and the kinds of courses we teach, as Afua mentioned, not just in certain blackness, but really making it that's the centrality of the course. So things like that.
I would just add, you're raising a good point, and to marry into that, it is a relational thing, it's a real thing. There's so much to be done around blackness, around the politics of blackness, but as I tried to say in my paper, part of this has also needs to be reaching beyond identity politics, and I call it risky work, because it is risky work. In a way, anything that I do on blackness is off my skin. It's not something I teach officially. It's not one of the courses that I can do in that area. But it has to be a symbiotic thing. So if there's, so for example, when I set up the Center for Cultural Identity and Education, somebody asked me, so why isn't your center a black center? Well, it isn't a black center because my politics extends beyond blackness. And I wouldn't have done a center that was only about blackness. So that's the openness. But you also see other people practicing a very closed politics where it's about their identity, which is why I quoted Audre Lorde. It's not about going and taking over somebody else's politics, but us reaching out to one another in any way that people are being minoritized and saying, how can I not only do my own identity work, but reach out and see what alliances I can make. Because as long as everything is divided into neat little boxes, then the power structures remain the same. So it's a way of thinking beyond part of what you're raising is a way of thinking beyond one's identity politics, but it also also needs to be a reciprocity to it.
Thank you very much. One of the things, if you would say something, one of the things, and I'll be with you in 1 second, that we need to think about is that Black feminists actually made an inroad in the social sciences. It has radically changed the way we think about the social sciences in terms of intersectionality. It was out of their reality that has shook up the social sciences. So, in a sense that we do need to, on one hand, acknowledge the notion about our own racial identity, we also need to, as Handel said, reach out and see the intersectionalities in other people's experiences that are similar but different to ours.
I would like to thank you, each of you, for this session. Actually, thank you, it's nothing. It's not enough, it's nothing. Because what you've done is like psychotherapy. That's the way I receive it. Anyway, I think maybe I'm not alone. And I hope that you're going to be able to do this kind of session every year in every Congress, in this Congress, every year. Now, I know that some of you, maybe Handel, and you know a little bit about the Quebecois context. And I'm afraid now that you didn't talk at all about the Francophone part of the Canadian Academy. And I'm afraid that the fracture we see in Canadian society between Francophone and Anglophone, I'm afraid that we're going to see this fracture between Blacks in the academy, between Francophone, Black Francophone, or Black Anglophone. So I would like, and there are problems there too. I regret to say that there are big problems to be a Black professor, Black academy in the context of the Quebec University. So I would like to hear you a little bit about the Blackness and this linguistic dimension here in the Canadian context. Thank you so much.
I think the people who are fluent in French have a strong responsibility to address that kind of issue. That's just I'm just being flippant there. But in some ways, you're right. I did mention McGill in my talk, but that's not mentioned in Francophone Canada at all. You're right in the sense that this comes up even within disciplinary and interdisciplinary work. In the field that I would do the most work in cultural studies, this is one of the main critiques, that there's not enough of Francophone or any other representations beyond English. So people not only do the discourse in English, but it has consequences for who is represented and how the identity is in fact represented. I mean, I mentioned people coming from Francophone Africa, for example, in my talk. But you're right in the sense that by speaking in English and giving examples, and for me, I can only speak to the institutions who I've actually been at. What happens then, this is again about the politics of representation. You're very right that then what happens is certain narratives, certain stories, certain parts of the country end up not being represented in that way. I'm not going to give the specifics of what is going on in Quebec. I'm just acknowledging that you're making a very important point.
Yeah, and I think that's the hegemony of English. That's the linguicism. The kind of dominance of English, that the Anglophone doesn't feel that he or she has to know anything else, even in a so-called bilingual country. So I think it's something we need to work on. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
I do acknowledge what you said about Black academics in Quebec or Francophone academics having some of the issues that we described here, having been aware of an issue at University of Montreal where a Black faculty left because of, and came to Ontario actually because of lots of racial discrimination. So, I mean, the conversation continues, and maybe this is something that we can do as a group within BCSA, or just not necessarily, but just to have that conversation and that connection, that relationship.
Well, the questions have been really robust and wide-ranging, and really, really appreciate everybody. I do have to cut it off now, if that's okay. We can continue the conversations outside. That's all right. There's somebody else that may need to come in now.